Dr. Hamid, if you never ended up doing general surgery, what do you think you would have done?
Huh. Um, Jeff, thanks for having me on this podcast. Uh, and I'm really excited about being here and what you're doing. And if I wasn't a general surgeon, I always kind of had this thought that I might be like an academic, like an English professor or a physics professor or something like that, to have a sort of a more of an academic life. Um, Maybe before that, I wanted to be an actor, and maybe before that, I wanted to be a professional football player. That's probably been the sequence of my career choices.
Fair enough. When I was younger, I wanted to be a dinosaur, but that didn't turn out very well. Um, Dear listener, welcome back to How It's Med, the podcast where we chat with people shaping the future of healthcare and health tech. On this podcast, we share the secrets, stories, and skills of the amazing founders, clinicians, investigators, engineers, and occasionally an Olympic athlete who went into venture capital. This time around, we're joined by Dr. Morad Hameed. Morad is a trauma surgeon intensivist at Vancouver General Hospital, an assistant professor of surgery at UBC, division head of general surgery at UBC, and the founder and chief medical officer of T6 Health Systems. Morad, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thank you. And how about you?
I was telling you that I just got off a 4-hour flight and drove home and then had another meeting. So I am tired and my cat is yelling at me from the bathroom, but that's okay. I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking.
You look good.
Um, Thank you. Thank you. Um, so, I mean, I dug back way into the previous podcasts and work that you've done, the interviews that you've done. And I have a pointed question here for you to kind of, lead into your own retelling of your origin story. Who's your biggest role model and how did his cabbage inspire your origin story?
Huh. My biggest role model is my aunt,
Ah,
my
yes.
mother's eldest sister. There are four sisters growing up in India around the time of India's independence, and their father was quite famous education scholar who was also a freedom fighter, a fighter for India's independence. And he raised his daughters with this a reverence for the truth, um, for humanism, for service. He himself became the Secretary of Education for India, and she became a philosopher and a sociologist. And she always taught us to um, have big ideals and to work hard to realize them, and really to pursue the truth and to try to make the world better. She was she was by far and away my biggest influence, even before going into medicine.
That's fair enough. And it seems like your work since your childhood has really fallen along that path. What specifically drove you towards medicine if your childhood was influenced by people with such big ideals and you wanted to be the NFL athlete for?
It was actually CFL.
CFL. Okay. Okay.
Just to be, but yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a great question. Well, my aunt was definitely my role model and guide, but I think I also had this urge to be of service,
Mm.
to try to do something that would benefit people, and also I just had this joy for learning about biology, for science, and I think that medicine seemed like a natural thing that combines service and this reverence or joy about science.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I mean, part of it is part of the next question that follows really is the distinction between medicine and surgery. You chose to go into surgery. Why go down that specific path?
Yeah, I started out when I was very young, thinking that I would be a cardiac surgeon. Um, I learned about it because my father had congestive heart failure, and so I grew up thinking that that would be an amazing uh, way to serve, as to be a cardiac surgeon. And then when I got into medical school, by then my focus became um, more in the medical side. So I actually wanted to be an internist. And for the first 2 or 3 years of medical school, I was kind of preparing for life in internal medicine. And then my second last rotation in medical school was general surgery, and I approached that with a lot of trepidation. I didn't think that I could do the hours. I didn't know if I could keep up with the pace. I didn't know if I could tolerate some of the harsh training environment that I heard about. But I met two more of my biggest role models. My attending surgeon, Dr. Morad uh, welcomed me, treated me as a member of his team, and just opened up like the incredible wonders of surgery to me. And my chief resident, Grant O'Keefe, who is still a friend today, was just brilliant. He was an unconventional thinker and a technically gifted surgeon, and he wanted to go into trauma surgery, wanted to subspecialize in trauma surgery, and actually, I kind of followed him. So I was with an impressionable age, and when I got to that rotation, I couldn't believe how fun it was, how fulfilling it was, how fast paced, and how welcoming it was, and how amazing it was to be part of a team and part of a culture that was dedicated to the same things that I cared about. So I switched really from internal medicine to general surgery at that moment.
Hmm. I mean, general surgery, like all medicine, is quite detail focused, and perhaps during the actual surgery itself, even more so because you have to be able to carry out the intricate details of the surgery with precision in order to get to the goal that you want for the patient's benefit without doing harm. So, how did that line of thinking and how did that line of training clash, or I guess, go along with the ideals that you were raised with that have since influenced much of your, I guess, other work?
Man, Jeff, these are really, really good questions. Thank you for that one. So, yeah, um, very perceptive. So, obviously, general surgery deals with sort of almost micro level precision. You have to be precise, you have to be technical, and you have to make good decisions on behalf of your patients. It's a very intense one on one type of existence. And, um, but I realized that general surgeons are also leaders. They lead their teams in the operating room. They often, because of their training and decision making ability, they become leaders within their hospitals. But it still didn't connect as broadly with society as I hoped, and I was looking for a way to reconcile this. And so early on in my training, I discovered that some surgeons could do training in public health, and in particular, one of my uh, family friends did she was a surgical oncologist, and did a master's degree in public health. And I just thought that's so intriguing. Like, what is the connection between surgery and public health? This very focused, micro level type of uh, um, concentration, and then a societal level concentration. How could you reconcile the two things? Um, but then it became clear to me that anyone who's involved with health can advocate for their patients one on one, but can take those insights to inform the way that policy is developed to promote population health. And I was interested in trauma surgery. And when I did training in public health, I realized that trauma is also a public health issue. And injury control can be very much approached at a population level. And what better advocates could there be for injury control than people that look after injured patients every day? So just making that connection between individual patients and societal health was like a big revelation for me. And that's a direction that I was encouraged to pursue academically.
In developing that connection between the patient level practice of trauma surgery and the epidemiological thinking of how to prevent trauma or even how to best prepare systems to handle trauma,
Yeah.
did you ever have any struggles in terms of making the switch? Or was there a certain way of thinking that helped you make that switch in perspective more easily?
I had when I was in my first day of my MPH, my master's in public health, I had a professor who was a physician, an emergency physician. Um, and she also had sort of a high level health policy position in Massachusetts. And she said that as an emergency physician, she would sew up people's lacerations, she would treat their gunshot wounds, and then she would discharge them right back into the communities that they came from, right back to the risks that they would face. And sometimes she would see the same patient back in the same shift. And she just wanted to treat that at a deeper level. Like she wanted to address that revolving door. She wanted to address the broader traumas that affected and placed that patient at risk and made them vulnerable. So it's a like the individual patient focus and the population level focus. It's very synergistic. Like they inform each other and they collectively add up to greater than the sum of their parts. So it's actually one area of interest kind of inspires the other in a way.
Mhm. I share, I can empathize with that story that your instructor told, because in my own shifts, I've seen patients come back for the same presentations. I think the one that's most salient in most Canadians' mind is the opioid overdose crisis that's ongoing throughout Canada right now. And it can be so easy to get overwhelmed by the day-to-day practice in terms of, managing things on a patient level, and then going back home feeling emotionally and morally distraught, and then trying to find some way to do things. Do you think that the MPH was the best way that you could have prepared yourself to manage these problems on a systems level? Or thinking back now, would you have taken a different path?
For me, I think it was still the best thing. It was a way. It really opened my eyes to what's possible. In the program that I was in at Harvard, I got to learn from people who really thought that they could change the world and actually were changing the world. And I could see that their studies were impacting policy and population health. And it really gave me the sort of faith that um, that ideas matter, and that big thinking and ambition can help to change, to make a change. And so for me, that the MPH really complemented my clinical training. It just broadened my perspective a lot. Sometimes I think that over my career, I've learned about other fields, like for example, like organizational psychology, how teams work together, um, uh, how they integrate, how they create situation awareness, how they work toward a common purpose. That sometimes I think that might have been a cool thing to focus on. Yeah, and then in the innovation space, I've gotten more interested in lately. Sometimes I wonder if uh, design, design thinking that didn't exist when I was training, but how do people incorporate design thinking into systems change? That seemed pretty good. But for me, I'm happy with the master's in public health and the pathways that that's opened up for me.
Mhm.
And
Speaking
just,
of,
oh,
oh,
sorry,
go ahead. Go
I was
ahead.
gonna say like, taking that thought about clinical surgery and public health, like that synergy, like a little bit further. One of my friends is a trauma surgeon, and he is the founding director of the trauma program at the University of Chicago. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the south side of Chicago, which is like a hot spot for gun violence, until recently did not have a trauma center. And it was called actually a trauma desert, meaning that patients who were in that war zone had to go almost outside of their own region to get trauma care. And the reason they didn't have a trauma center is because the University of Chicago thought that they would lose money on opening a facility like that. So it was actually the community, Southside Chicago community, that lobbied to open a trauma center. And after a lot of pressure, social pressure, political pressure, they opened this trauma center. And this friend of mine, Selwyn Rogers, he was recruited to be their first trauma medical director. And he immediately also started this community engagement process. And he's also public health trained. But he thought that the only way that a trauma center could be successful is if it breaks down its walls and engages with the community. And he actually became their director of community engagement as well. And so he went to churches and community centers and schools and tried to understand what the social determinants of injury risk were, because he felt in that way, the trauma center could be more responsive and more adaptive and could actually prevent some of the traumas that actually lead to the actual physical trauma. So I think that's kind of like a natural extension of this way of thinking of combining clinical medicine with public health.
Mhm. That's a really insightful story as to what the competing interests in systems are and the innovations and investigations that need to happen in order to improve patient and community outcome. Kind of related to the next question, which I wanted to ask, which was your previous mention in a previous podcast about the three waves of safety and practice in general surgery. Can you explain this concept? I found it super interesting because there are different levels of innovation that you had mentioned that have allowed general surgery to become what it is today and in the future to become what it will be.
I just by chance came across a paper written in the Harvard Business Review by a surgeon called Amir Ghaffari, who at the time was a professor of surgery at the University of Michigan. And by the way, it's so interesting. I cold emailed Dr. Ghaffari and asked him if he would like to come to Vancouver as a visiting professor. And he responded and he said yes. And he came in November and headlined a symposium that we ran called Surgical Systems Redesign. And he turned out to be an amazing person and become a good friend. Um, but yeah, so what Dr. Ghaffari said is that the history of innovation in surgery has three waves, waves of innovation in surgery. And so what he does is he draws a graph, and on the x-axis of the graph is time. On the y-axis is patient mortality. And it's a conceptual graph. And what he shows is that he shows three curves, uh, declining curves that hit a inflection point, decline again, and then the third curve that hits an inflection point, declines again. And basically what he says is with each innovation, we drop mortality in surgery, but eventually the curve starts to level off. And then you have the next innovation and it drops mortality again, but eventually you have some diminishing returns and the curve levels off. And then the third innovation drops mortality again when the curve levels off. But it's fun to hear what the curves are, what the curves represent. So the first curve is technology. The introduction of technology in surgery drops mortality. Things like laparoscopic surgery, or in trauma, we have damage control surgery. These things have an impact on mortality, but eventually that impact starts to level off as technology is adopted. The next curve is standardization. As we standardize healthcare, meaning that we do it the same way every time, we reduce variability at each step, mortality drops again. And that means that the knowledge that we have of surgery begins to permeate, all hospitals and all surgical services. And so that standardization kind of levels the playing field between services. It creates a uniform excellence. But eventually the benefits of standardization also level off, because all patients are not the same. And, so there's kind of a limit to how standardization can, eventually you'll have to tailor care to individual patients. And the third wave of innovation is the wave that we're currently that we're at the cusp of. And that wave is creating systems that are complex, adaptive, that learn, that emphasize the culture of care, that emphasize individualization of patient care. And that you could call that wave the wave of learning health systems. These are systems that begin to analyze data, collect data, analyze it in detail, visualize data, and report it, and learn from every patient that comes through the system. So that's sort of the interesting point where we find ourselves now, is where we know how to integrate technology, we know how to standardize, but can we function now as complex adaptive systems that can bring the right therapies to patients, in at the right time. Healthcare, surgical care has become more complex with time, and we can achieve a lot more. But I think the key is, can we integrate multidisciplinary inputs for patients to match the complexity that they present with to achieve great outcome?
Mhm. So if I'm to summarize what you said there, the first wave of innovation represents benefits in mortality and morbidity from improved uh, equipment or technology. The second wave represented standardization, so making sure that you're able to minimize variability in certain procedures or certain pathways of care to minimize morbidity or mortality from where you can within the system. But the next uh, combined kind of the benefits of the previous waves as well as the massive influx of data that we're able to gather today in order to, I guess, create what you call learning health systems. So you've mentioned some examples of innovations, and we've talked about or mentioned some in that previous little, I guess, summary. But what are some examples of innovations that help create learning health systems now?
Yeah, I think that so if you visualize a learning health system as a cycle, like a improvement cycle, and it's a circle. So on one half of the circle is data input. So you we're good at we can now collect data with electronic health records, with registries, with patient reported data, increasingly now with wearables and all that. We have this now ability to create these data rich environments around patients. But then the question is, what do you do with that data? Like, how do you, the other side of that cycle is the action side. So one is the learning side and one is the action side. And that there's this iterative process of continued data acquisition and analysis and continued systems change. So how do we collect data at high enough resolution, analyze it, report it, that it can actually provide meaningful insights to improve care? And data can be, like, as I mentioned, any of the things that we talked about. It can be in-hospital data, it could be process data, it could be outcomes data, it could be patient-reported data, it could be healthcare provider-reported data, it could be data on cost, it could even be data on planetary impact of healthcare. So all these data streams coming in. The problem, I think, where health systems are, we're not quite good at integrating that data into meaningful action. And so that's where we are now. And the question you asked is, do we have good examples of how this sort of new learning health systems approach actually improves care? We've started to do this at our hospital, Vancouver General Hospital, where we've created dashboards for all of our services. And now our services can respond to their dashboards. And we've seen in some of our units, like our liver transplant unit, we've actually seen improvements in patient outcomes uh, because they're starting to measure and respond and target sort of micro interventions to start try to optimize their dashboards. Um, so we're beginning to see where it's beginning to happen, but we're still early days.
That's super cool. I mean, part of it is being able to figure out how you can collect all that data. But I think the second half of it is being able to suss out which data points are relevant to gather because there's so much information to gather, but not all of it may truly be directly relevant to outcomes at hand. But you've helped develop a system that has become the integral part of a startup that helps gather relevant data in high acuity situations where you need to know what you're doing, what to do next in a very standardized approach, yet to an extent tailored to the extremely variable patient that might come in. And I'm talking about the product developed by T6 Health Systems. To really summarize things and break it down for the listener, if you had to explain what T6 does to a 5-year-old using only monosyllabic, bisyllabic words, how would you do it?
So T6 is an iPad where doctors can input data when they see a patient. And that data is transformed into information that can help them make decisions uh, and can help patients get better faster.
That was actually very well put for how complex of a product T6 is. But let's go all the way back. So you ended up doing so much education and you've done so much in your academic surgery career, but then T6 Health System seems like to an extent a natural extension. But what was the origin story behind it?
When I was I did most of my training in medicine and surgery in Edmonton, uh, Alberta, and but I did my trauma fellowship at the University of Miami, and um, that's a busy Miami. The University of Miami Trauma Center uh, is a busy place, and early on, one of my mentors there, Stephen Cohn, said that he recognized my public health training, and he said, "You're a public health person. Why don't you focus your research on public health?" So I thought that was a great idea. So one of the first studies we did was we tracked all patients, all little kids who came to our trauma center after being hit by cars. And in the morning, we would go see all those patients. We'd interview them, find out from their families where they were hit, what intersections. And then we would go out to those intersections and try to describe what we saw. And it was interesting when we showed up at some of those intersections. Um, the neighbors would come out of their houses, or people would come up to us and say, "Hey, this is a very dangerous intersection. Are you from the city? Are you going to do something about this stop sign or this traffic light or these road markings or these sidewalks?" And it really struck me that we came from the trauma center, like treating patients who came out of the community, and we were getting these incredible insights about the safety of the community and of society from people there. And we published that paper in the American Journal of Public Health. It was an amazing feeling that you could just publish something like that was so simple. And that sparked several years of research on using geographic information science, combining injury data with geography to identify hotspots around the city. Started in Calgary, came to Vancouver eventually. And we really found that injury is very much associated with geography. It's very much associated with the social determinants of health, that there's certain patient populations that are very vulnerable to being injured. That work continued. We started going to South Africa, and we started collaborating with surgeons at the University of Cape Town to do similar types of studies there. And again, the same thing, how the social determinants of health impacted injury risk. There were communities and neighborhoods that were vulnerable to injury. And so we decided with them that we would want to set up an injury database there so we could study this in more detail. And so we didn't exactly know how to start this. So what we did is we thought that, well, they don't have money for data registrars or data analysts. There wasn't in their budget to have that. So what we did is we designed a clinical documentation tool, a piece of paper that their surgical registrars, their residents would document on. And they would document their admission, their operations, their discharge summaries on a piece of paper. The paper had a carbon copy backing. And so the front would go on the chart. The carbon copy backing would go to the office, the trauma director's office. So we designed that record in consultation with the trauma surgeons, but also with the public health people at the University of Cape Town. So we were collecting public health information on these forms as well. And after about a year, we came back to Cape Town, and we've discovered what the assistant of the trauma director said. "What would you like me to do with the papers?" And so we said, "Well, what papers are you talking about?" We had like no idea what she was talking about. So, "What would you like to do with the papers?" And she looked a little irritated, actually. So we said, "It was the papers." So she took us around the corner, and these papers were stacked from a desk to the ceiling in 3 stacks. There were literally 10,000 records that had been accumulated over the course of the year, these carbon copy backing sheets. And it was a treasure trove of data. So we we had two of our graduate students input all of this data. It took about 4 months. And that data went into a database. It was 10,000 records. It was one of the richest data sets that we'd seen in a trauma center. And they used that to publish studies on their population. But that type of paper data collection, manual data input wasn't sustainable. We couldn't keep doing that because we would be too far behind if we tried to do it that way. Around that time, the iPad minis came out. And do you remember the iPad mini? So when that came out, it was a big deal. We thought, what if instead of writing on paper, the trauma teams document on the iPad mini? A lot of people thought it wouldn't work because the iPads would go missing, but we decided to try it. And that experiment lasted for about a year, and the iPads were successful in collecting another 10,000 records of trauma patients, operative records, discharge summaries. We could actually measure their treatment, their outcomes, their geography. And the University of Cape Town investigators published like 15 studies based on that data set. And so we realized that this point of care digital data collection, specifically geared towards trauma patients, could create these rich data sets that could be analyzed almost instantly because there's no delay in abstracting the data. Anyway, that whole process led to the formation of our company because we wanted to further develop the software. We wanted to make the data secure and safe and private. And we've been this company, which we call T6 Health Systems, for trauma care in the first 6 hours, the first critical 6 hours after injury. We want to be there collecting high resolution data. That company's been around now for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Can you highlight a hypothetical or de-identified, story that shows the value that T6 has on trauma patient management?
Well, yeah. So we think of the data that's collected by T6 to kind of fall into different tiers. Like there's different tiers of analysis. So like the first tier of analysis is like right at the point of care, you generate a score or you visualize data on an overhead screen. Right away, it's informing your awareness of that patient. There's another layer of data, another layer of analysis, which is quality improvement. Another layer, which is research. Another layer, which is prevention. Another layer, which is health policy. So the data that's streaming out has these can be repurposed in multiple ways to serve multiple different purposes. One simple thing is that in Cape Town, the user interface was open and the residents were documenting on it. And they were about to skip a step in documenting a spinal cord injury. But the digital interface pointed out that they should do a neurologic exam. And they picked up a patient with a spine fracture who could have, gone on to be mobilized and have a worse than spinal cord injury. So that data collection structure kind of placed some guidelines or guardrails around the care that created a bit more comprehensive care in the moment that would have saved a bad complication. Similarly, the system was being used in a trauma center in Texas, and there we had the iPads were acquiring data, but they were projecting data on a big overhead dashboard above the patient's bed. And a trauma surgeon walked in who hadn't seen the T6 system before and right away read the dashboard and realized that the patient needed to go for an urgent CT scan. And he, without even understanding the system or what was happening, it sort of immediately fast-tracked his judgment, and the patient was urgently transported for CT. So it's that early sort of collection of data that converts a chaotic and uncertain environment to a little bit more data-informed environment that can actually change patient care.
Mm-hmm. I recently spoke with an individual who helped create one of the first EMRs used in British Columbia, which was later acquired by a large telco. And his vision was specifically to create the infrastructure in order to collect massive amount of data that goes into medical decision making, and then to help guide that with processes that are automated or have guardrails built, which is exactly what you've done. So it's truly commendable that you managed to improve, um, I guess, patient outcomes, and from the data that streams out of there, also inform how policies locally are changed, guided in the future, so that you truly do have a learning health system. We've talked a lot about what exactly T6 is, but what we haven't talked about is the fact that entrepreneurship is nowhere near, at least in my perception, grand societal ideals, public health, or surgery. So, how did the business aspect of this fold in when you were managing so much outside of your, I guess, of this entrepreneurial career of yours?
Yeah, it's a great another great question, Jeff. So I think that I love um, I love being a trauma surgeon and intensivist, and I love being in an academic environment where I get to be inspired by fellows and residents and medical students every day. And that always sort of a big part of me. And it was hard to give that. I actually couldn't give that up. It's such a defining thing. But I also knew that I had this um, real interest in engaging uh, with public health and population health, as we talked about. And I really saw data as the, the 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 rigorous collection and analysis of data as a pathway to try to engage with social determinants of health and population health. And getting into the digital space was a bit of a fortuitous thing. It came from a love of analyzing data and trying to generate policy relevant insights. And I just realized that in order to build this, it's hard to do it from grants. The grant funding cycles are long, they're competitive. The success rate is often around 10% for big grants. But um, to develop technology that's sort of in an agile way, in a responsive way, and in a very strong, like in a secure way, takes investment. So we had to explore that idea of sort of this public-private partnership in creating this data environment that we had envisioned. And it's a really different world. You have to you have to build a business plan. You have to pitch it. You have to bring rigor. You have to pay more attention to cost, uh, and you have to be responsible about how you plan and roll it. And you really have to hustle to see if people can use it and can start to derive benefit from it. So it's been a very much a learning curve to do that. I never envisioned going into business or engaging with the private sector at all. But our hope is that if the business idea works, and people people like T6, the platform, enough to buy it, that we can then bring it to more austere environments and just deliver it in a sustainable way. So the whole idea is it's almost like a social enterprise, the way I see it. Like if you can provide enough benefit for the people that will pay for it, you can extend that benefit even sort of beyond those boundaries and try to really impact public health more universally. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's kind of the concept and why we're pursuing it like this.
That makes sense. I think it certainly needs business as a vehicle in order to scale the impact that T6 could have over the world, because being able to limit it or limiting it based off of grant availability as well as the geographic restriction of the products of those grants would to some extent be limiting the benefit that the solution could have over a broader global or geographic area. To speak more to the business side that you've encountered so far, because you've been balancing trauma surgery career overall, and you've lived to an extent through the entrepreneurial journey. What has your experience with failures in the startup world been like? And how does that compare with your experience of failures in search?
Jeff, you know those wise sayings like Thomas Edison said something like, I haven't failed. I've only found 10,000 ways that didn't work, or something like that. That these failures are a pathway to success. Or Michael Jordan says that he's missed thousands of shots, uh, you know, in its life. Or Wayne Gretzky saying that you miss every shot that you don't take. These resonate so much. You start to identify so much with these pathways of failure, and eventually, what I realized is that, like in medicine, we don't this journey in medicine or other areas of academic endeavor, sometimes people don't fail very much. Like they go from one success to another. They go from school to university to their jobs, and it's always like a path that's mostly characterized by success. But what I realized is that when you're doing something that hasn't been done before, when you're trying to do something for the first time, um, you have to anticipate failures and actually see them as guideposts. Um, when you fail, it means that you've progressed, your understanding has deepened, and you just have to have this tolerance for one failure after another, after another, after another. And to this day, like we're 10 years almost into this company, and it's still not successful. Um, we failed so many times, but over that 9 or 10 years, we've acquired so much experience, so much depth, so much agility. We design better, and we have much more nuanced understanding of our goals and the goals of healthcare systems. So that really does matter. It does add up. So I would just say that I've learned to get comfortable with failure, to see it as evidence of progress, and just to try to pursue this and take a long view of it. It certainly can be discouraging, like at times, but every so often you get some success that just turns everything around, that gives you new momentum, that sparks another round of creativity. So it's definitely uh, an interesting journey, I would say.
Mhm. You said something really interesting there, which was that the company still is not successful. So, what would you qualify as success from T6's point of view?
Well, we've only just started generating revenue within the last 2 years or so. So our investor, who I haven't mentioned, but who's been an absolute champion and visionary, he's been tough on us to do a good job and to work hard, but he's never lost the drive to make this successful. So he's been patient, and we've only started making revenue in the last couple of years. And within the last year, we've had a very close partnership with the U.S. Department of Defense to redesign their trauma user interfaces in their military trauma facilities. So I would say, to me, it would be successful if we could make up all the investment that was placed in us back. Uh, The revenue started to come, but probably haven't quite broken even yet. To me, that would be one marker of success. Other people might say when the company is like profitable year after year, or when companies sold. But to me, it's like if everybody who's in our company who's worked so hard begins to have some job security and some confidence that what they're doing is sustainable, that sustainability to me would be great evidence of success.
You put a really interesting perspective into that last definition of success to ensure that those who worked with you as a team on this company are taken care of in terms of job security, and some certainty as to where they're going to be in the future. How has your perspective and training as a trauma surgeon and in public health informed how you manage, to what extent you do, T6?
I've been so lucky because I'm one of 5 founders. We have founders from technology background and founders from a business background. And my wife is one of the founders. She's a physician and a health economist. So we have that health economics background. So it's a pretty diverse group of founders. And what's so interesting is that they all believe fundamentally that the work is important. Like they feel like some of them are like serial startup people who've been working at other startups. When they came to T6, they really felt a sense of purpose. And to this day, I hear that what we're doing could save lives. What we're doing could reduce inequity. And so even our technology people now, like our chief technology officer, for example, knows a lot about trauma, like surprisingly a lot. Um, and the things he says sometimes when he's talking in front of an audience, you can't tell if he's not a physician, but he's an engineer. And so people have really internalized the mission of the company. And so in that way, I've been blessed to work with friends who have that same passion as I do. And the leadership, day-to-day leadership comes from them. I have to kind of inform a little bit the direction of the company and the vision of the company. But they run with this day to day. They work hard. And in some ways, they've allowed me to continue my clinical career. And they feel that there's value in having somebody who's on the front lines working clinically and can provide insights into their development, into the development of our system. But we've talked about this before. I know that there is a dichotomy among investors that want their leaders to be clinically active, and some that would absolutely not invest in a company where someone was part-time clinical.
So we'll see what the tally comes out to coming up. Maybe I'll put up the running count based off the podcast in the future. Before we close off, no worries. Before we close off, I give all of our guests an opportunity to share something that they're passionate about, whether or not it's T6 or whether or not it's something else. If you have any pluggables to plug, the stage is yours.
Well, Jeff, I've given you my life story. I would just maybe give a plug for your podcast and your career. It's been great to meet you, and what you're doing is phenomenal. Like shedding light on these different kinds of journeys, and I think that it's very commendable. So I just think it's a great idea. I'm grateful to participate in it, and I just wish you all the best on this podcast. I think, I can't wait to see where you take it next.
Thank you so much, Rad. All right, till next time.